Good news. You're Cleopatra, last pharaoh, power broker, fluent in 9 languages, dressed for divine rule. Bad news. You just woke up in medieval Europe, where the most eligible bachelor bathes in spring. And maybe again come Christmas. Romantic dinner? If it isn't wriggling, it's probably yesterday's leftovers. You once held court in marble palaces, dropping Latin puns on Julius Caesar and trading secrets with Antony over honeyed figs. Now you're in a drafty stone keep. The only candlelight comes from pig fat, and that mysterious fragrance in the air. It's 3 parts unwashed night, 2 parts chamber pot, and a dash of whatever died in the moat last Tuesday. Welcome to Medieval Tinder, Cleo. Swipe left for your own safety. You're standing in what passes for a great hall, though calling it great feels like medieval false advertising. Stone walls weep moisture like they're mourning their own existence. The rushes scattered across the floor hide God knows what underneath. You can hear things scurrying beneath your feet. Things with too many legs and questionable hygiene habits. The whole place smells like wet dog mixed with centuries of questionable decisions. Your senses are under assault from this medieval nightmare. Back in Alexandria, your palace gleamed with polished marble that reflected sunlight like captured starfire. Silk curtains danced in Mediterranean breezes while servants burned incense that actually smelled pleasant. You had gardens where exotic flowers bloomed year-round, fountains that sang with crystal-clear water, and mosaics that told stories of gods and heroes. Now you're staring at grey stones that look like they were assembled by drunk giants with architectural grudges. The contrast hits you like a plague cart running full speed into a brick wall. You once bathed in milk and honey, soaking in marble tubs, while attendants mixed oils that cost more than most people's annual income. Egyptian perfumers created custom fragrances just for your skin. The local lord here considers himself clean if he dunked his face in a bucket this month. Maybe twice if there's a special occasion. Like someone dying or getting married. Same thing, really. You spoke 9 languages fluently, switching between Greek and Latin mid-sentence to make diplomatic points that could shift the balance of Mediterranean power. You conducted meetings that shaped empires, negotiating treaties while scholars took notes on papyrus scrolls. Your conversations with Caesar weren't just pillow talk. They were intellectual duels where wit mattered as much as military strategy. Here, the most educated noble can barely grunt through Latin mass without forgetting half the words. Their idea of multilingual communication is knowing how to say more ale in the local peasant dialect. Back home, your golden barge glided down the Nile like a floating palace. Musicians played harps and lyres while dancers moved like liquid poetry. Servants fanned you with peacock feathers that caught the light like rainbow prisms. The boat itself was a work of art, carved with hieroglyphs that told the stories of your divine lineage. Purple silk canopies blocked the sun, while you reclined on cushions stuffed with the softest down. Even your transportation was a statement of power that made foreign ambassadors weep with envy. Here, transportation means a wooden cart that doubles as a mobile torture device. The wheels are more theoretical than functional, turning at angles that seem to violate basic physics. They're pulled by oxen that smell better than their owners, which tells you everything about medieval standards of personal care. The cart bounces over ruts and stones, like it's actively trying to separate your spine from your skull. No cushions, no shade, no dignity, just splinters, animal stench, and the constant fear that the whole contraption will fall apart mid-journey. The romantic candle-lit atmosphere comes courtesy of pig-fat candles that smell like a butcher shop caught fire. The smoke makes your eyes water and fills the air with a greasy haze that coats everything in a film of rendered animal fat. Back in Egypt, you had beeswax candles that burned clean and bright, filling rooms with the subtle scent of honey. Oil lamps flickered with flames that danced like tiny suns, casting warm light that made gold jewelry gleam and silk robes shimmer. Here, the lighting situation makes you wonder if darkness might actually be preferable. The floor rushes squelch underfoot with mysterious dampness. You're afraid to look too closely at what might be soaking through from below. Medieval waste management apparently involves hoping gravity will take care of everything eventually. The walls sport tapestries that might have been colourful once, before decades of smoke and neglect turned them into abstract studies in brown and grey. Even the furniture looks uncomfortable, like it was designed by someone who thought suffering built character. You realise this isn't just culture shock. It's a complete sensory apocalypse that makes Egyptian tomb curses look pleasant by comparison. At least mummies had the courtesy to dry out first. This medieval reality assaults every sense simultaneously with a coordinated attack of sights, sounds, and smells that would make hardened Roman soldiers surrender immediately. The air itself feels thick with centuries of accumulated human misery and questionable cooking choices. Your legendary diplomatic skills navigated the treacherous waters of Roman politics, where senators plotted with silver tongues and golden daggers. You survived palace intrigue that would make modern political scandals look like children's games. You commanded fleets, controlled trade routes that connected 3 continents, and held the economic fate of the known world in your jeweled hands. But medieval Europe presents challenges that make dealing with Roman corruption seem straightforward. But hey, at least you still have your legendary charm, right? The same magnetic personality that made Julius Caesar forget about conquering Gaul for a few months. The wit that kept Mark Antony entertained when he could have been running an empire. Your ability to command attention in any room, speak to scholars and soldiers with equal fluency, and turn political necessity into genuine attraction. Time to see what passes for eligible bachelors in this cesspit. Surely your proven track record with powerful men will translate to medieval circumstances. How hard could it be to find someone worth your time in an era where the bar is set somewhere underground? Your first swipe reveals a knight in supposedly shining armor, though the shine appears to be mostly grease and questionable stains that form abstract patterns across his breastplate. The metal looks like it hasn't seen proper polish since the Crusades ended badly. Dark smudges cover areas that might once have gleamed, creating a patchwork of tarnish that tells stories you probably don't want to hear. His helmet sits at an odd angle, like it's given up trying to look dignified. The whole ensemble suggests someone who heard about armor maintenance, but decided it was optional. He claims to be chivalrous, noble, a defender of honor who die for your virtue without hesitation. His profile reads like a medieval romance novel, written by someone who never met an actual knight. He mentions protecting fair maidens, upholding justice, and serving the realm with unwavering dedication. The words sound impressive until you realize they're probably copied from the same template every knight uses on medieval dating apps. His list of achievements includes defeated 3 bandits and helped an old woman cross a muddy road which feels like padding his resume with community service hours. Problem is, he might actually kill you first with his breath, which suggests he's been eating nothing but onions and regret for the past decade. The smell hits you through the screen somehow, a combination of rotting teeth and whatever died in his mouth last winter. You can practically see the green vapor rising from his direction, like swamp gas on a hot day. His dental situation appears to involve more gaps than actual teeth, and the remaining ones look like tiny brown tombstones marking where proper oral care went to die. Medieval dentistry consisted mostly of prayer and pliers, which explains the general dental apocalypse happening in his mouth. His idea of courtly romance involves serenading you outside your window at 3 a.m, while his horse relieves itself on the cobblestones below. The romantic image gets complicated when you factor in the horse's digestive schedule and the knight's apparent tone deafness. His singing voice sounds like a cat being slowly strangled by someone who hates music. The lyrics he's composed focus heavily on your eyes, which he compares to stars in a muddy puddle and the glow of pig-fat candles on a dark night. His poetic skills need work, assuming work could actually help at this point. You once had Julius Caesar reciting actual poetry in perfect Latin, verses that flowed like honey and cut like expertly crafted daggers. Caesar could quote Catullus from memory while discussing military strategy, switching between languages mid-sentence to make political points that shifted the balance of power across the Mediterranean. His wit matched his ambition, and his conversations left you intellectually satisfied as well as physically impressed. This guy can barely pronounce his own name without spitting, creating a small shower every time he introduces himself. His attempts at Latin sound like he's choking on the words before they leave his mouth. Medieval courtly love demanded that knights worship from afar, maintaining proper distance while expressing devotion through acts of service and artistic tribute. The tradition emphasized spiritual connection over physical proximity, which honestly works in your favor given the smell situation. Knights were supposed to pine dramatically, write terrible poetry, and perform heroic deeds to win their lady's attention. The system kept everyone at a safe distance while maintaining the illusion of romance. You're starting to understand why medieval ladies developed this rule. Close contact would have been a health hazard. His profile mentions he hasn't removed his chainmail in 6 months because it's become part of his identity, which explains several concerning details about his overall presentation. The metal links have probably fused with his undergarments by now, creating a second skin of rust and accumulated sweat. Chainmail requires constant maintenance to prevent corrosion, but he's apparently decided that personal hygiene is less important than maintaining his knightly image. The armor has become a wearable bacteria colony, evolving its own ecosystem in the warm, moist environment between the metal and his skin. Medieval knights did sometimes sleep in their armor during campaigns, but making it a lifestyle choice seems excessive. The chainmail situation also explains his limited range of motion and the metallic creaking sound that accompanies his every movement. He walks like a rusty gate that needs oil, producing sounds that alert everyone within 100 yards to his location. Stealth missions are definitely out of the question. His armor has developed its own personality, making decisions about when and how he can move. Getting dressed involves negotiating with several pounds of corroded metal that may or may not cooperate on any given day. You realize that dying for love in medieval times might literally mean dying from the suitor's hygiene, rather than any dramatic gesture involving swords or sacrifice. The concept of martyrdom takes on new meaning when basic human contact poses genuine health risks. Your legendary romantic history included political intrigue, passionate affairs, and strategic seductions that changed the course of empires. None of those relationships required hazmat equipment or medical supervision. Even your most dangerous lovers posed threats that were intentional and dignified, not accidental and aromatic. Medieval romance apparently involves more risk than Egyptian politics. And that's saying something, considering your family tree included more assassination attempts than most war zones. At least Roman senators had the courtesy to stab you metaphorically instead of slowly poisoning you with their personal atmosphere. The knight's devotion might be genuine, but his presentation suggests that good intentions can't overcome poor execution. Swipe left so hard you nearly crack the wooden tablet this medieval app is somehow running on. The technology itself seems confused about existing in this time period, but is definitely getting a workout from your increasingly frantic rejection gestures. A Viking raider swipes onto your screen, and his profile picture shows him mid-battle cry, covered in what you desperately hope is just mud and berry juice. The dark stains splattered across his face and beard create patterns that look suspiciously like abstract art painted with bodily fluids. His eyes gleam with the kind of wild enthusiasm usually reserved for people who've spent too much time alone with sharp objects. The wooden tablet displays his image with all the artistic skill of a drunk monk drawing with his offhand. But the message comes through clearly. This man enjoys violence as a recreational activity. His bio reads like a medieval wanted poster written by someone proud of their crimes. Loves include axes, pillaging, and the open sea, which sounds romantic until you realize he's talking about using those axes on people who disagree with his pillaging schedule. His dislikes list monks specifically, along with anything that isn't a longboat, which suggests his interests are both narrow and violent. The profile mentions his favorite hobbies include longboat maintenance, intimidating monks, and braiding human hair into his beard. The hair isn't necessarily his own, which raises questions about where he sources his grooming materials and whether the previous owners consented to the donation. He considers Netflix and chill to be raiding villages and then chilling the survivors in the nearest fjord, which puts a dark spin on modern dating terminology. His idea of a romantic evening involves setting fire to religious buildings while collecting ears as trophies. The ears apparently serve as conversation starters, though you can't imagine many conversations that would benefit from that particular icebreaker. His leisure activities center around destruction and intimidation, which would make dinner dates challenging since most restaurants prefer customers who don't threaten the waitstaff with medieval weapons. Viking courtship rituals apparently involve kidnapping, which would be a significant step down from your usual diplomatic marriage alliances. Your romantic history included careful negotiations between powerful families, strategic alliances that shifted the balance of Mediterranean politics, and ceremonies that required months of planning. Eric's approach seems more spontaneous, involving surprise boat trips, where consent is optional, and the destination remains unclear until you arrive. The traditional Viking wedding gift was apparently the bride herself, taken from her family through carefully planned raids that doubled as romantic gestures. You seduced two of Rome's most powerful men with wit and intelligence, engaging in conversations that spanned literature, philosophy, and military strategy. Julius Caesar appreciated your ability to discuss Alexandrian scholarship, while planning Egyptian trade policies. Mark Antony found your political insights as attractive as your physical beauty, and your pillow talk included genuine diplomatic breakthroughs that affected the fate of nations. Your seduction technique involved layers of intellectual complexity wrapped in physical allure that left powerful men completely captivated. Eric's seduction technique involves yelling and brandishing an axe, which lacks the subtle sophistication of your previous romantic encounters. His courtship strategy appears to be intimidation-based, relying on the assumption that fear creates attraction. The yelling serves multiple purposes, establishing dominance while also checking whether potential partners can hear properly over the sound of violence. His axe brandishing skills probably impress other Vikings, but you've seen actual Roman legions in formation, which makes one man with a hand weapon seem less threatening and more like performance art. He promises to share his treasure hoard with you, which sounds generous until you examine the contents of his accumulated wealth. His treasure appears to be mostly stolen church bells and suspicious bone jewelry that raises questions about the artistic process and raw material sourcing. The church bells suggest his raiding targets focus heavily on religious institutions, which probably limits his social circle to other people who enjoy making enemies of organized religion. The bone jewelry collection hints at crafting hobbies that most people would find deeply disturbing, especially if you start wondering about the origin stories of each piece. Viking treasure accumulation followed the principle that anything not nailed down was fair game, and even nailed down items just required better tools. Their economic system relied heavily on what economists would politely call involuntary wealth redistribution. Eric's collection probably represents years of dedicated theft from people who couldn't adequately defend their belongings against surprise boat attacks. The variety of items suggests either very eclectic taste or complete inability to focus during robbery attempts. The promise of shared wealth sounds appealing until you consider the practical implications of accepting stolen goods from someone whose retirement plan involves continued piracy until death or imprisonment. Your own wealth came from controlling Egyptian trade routes and managing agricultural production that fed much of the Roman Empire. You understood economics on a scale that affected international commerce, while Eric's financial planning appears to involve taking things from other people and hoping they don't organize effective revenge. You've dealt with Roman senators who could betray allies with silver tongues and golden promises, but at least they stabbed you in the back metaphorically rather than literally. Political intrigue in your world involved complex schemes that unfolded over months or years, with betrayals that required genuine creativity and extensive planning. Eric's approach to conflict resolution seems more direct, involving actual weapons and immediate violence. Roman backstabbing required intelligence and patience, while Viking backstabbing apparently just requires a sharp object and poor impulse control. When pillaging and plundering represent someone's primary personality traits, even your legendary tolerance for dangerous men discovers its practical limits. You've always been attracted to power and ambition, but there's a difference between men who build empires and men who just burn things down without replacement plans. A figure in black robes and a bird-like mask appears on your screen. And finally, someone with a sense of style and mystery that doesn't immediately assault your visual senses. The long leather beak curves downward, like some exotic bird of prey, while his dark cloak flows around him with theatrical drama that reminds you of your own flair for stunning entrances. His silhouette cuts an impressive figure against the medieval backdrop, suggesting someone who understands the power of visual presentation and the importance of making memorable first impressions. For a moment, you feel a spark of recognition, like meeting someone who appreciates the art of dramatic costume design. The long leather beak and dark cloak give him an air of dangerous sophistication that reminds you of your own legendary dramatic flair and appreciation for theatrical presentation. His outfit suggests someone who thinks carefully about image management and understands that appearance communicates power before you even speak a word. The black robes flow with practiced elegance, creating movement that catches the eye and holds attention. His posture suggests confidence, mystery, and perhaps the kind of intellectual depth that's been missing from your previous medieval dating prospects. The whole presentation screams sophistication compared to the unwashed masses you've been scrolling through, until you realize the mask isn't a fashion statement designed to create intrigue and mystique. It's stuffed with herbs to block the smell of rotting flesh he deals with on a daily basis as part of his medical practice. The leather beak contains aromatic plants meant to filter the air and protect him from what medieval people believed caused disease through bad smells. His mysterious costume transforms from fashion choice to occupational safety equipment, which changes the entire romantic dynamic considerably. The dramatic presentation becomes practical necessity when your job involves close contact with plague victims and their various bodily fluids. His medical expertise consists of bloodletting, prayer, and the occasional amputation performed with a rusty saw that probably hasn't been cleaned since the last patient bled all over it. Medieval medicine operated on principles that would make ancient Egyptian physicians weep with frustration and disbelief. Bloodletting was prescribed for almost every ailment, based on the theory that illness came from imbalanced body fluids that needed draining. Prayer served as both treatment and diagnostic tool, with the assumption that divine intervention could cure what human knowledge couldn't understand. Amputations happened frequently, partly because gangrene was common, and partly because medieval surgeons believed removing diseased parts would save the rest. You had access to Alexandria's legendary medical knowledge, including surgical techniques that wouldn't be rediscovered for centuries after your death. Egyptian physicians performed complex operations with precision instruments, understood anatomy through careful study, and developed treatments based on systematic observation rather than religious superstition. Your court doctors could set broken bones, treat infections with effective remedies, and perform surgical procedures that saved lives rather than ending them. The medical library of Alexandria contained knowledge from Greek, Egyptian, and other cultures, creating a comprehensive understanding of human health that medieval Europe had completely lost. Medieval surgical tools looked like they were designed by someone who confused medical treatment with creative torture. Bone saws resembled weapons more than healing instruments, and most hadn't been cleaned properly since their creation. Surgical procedures happened without anesthesia, antiseptics, or basic understanding of infection control. Patients frequently died from the treatment rather than the original disease, which made seeking medical help a genuinely life-threatening decision. The survival rate for major procedures was so low that many people preferred to take their chances with whatever was killing them, rather than submit to medieval medical intervention. His romantic dinner conversation would inevitably turn to boils, festering wounds, and the various creative ways the Black Death manifests in human bodies across different demographics and geographic regions. Topics would include the color variations of infected tissue, the smell differences between various types of rot, and his professional observations about how quickly different age groups succumb to plague symptoms. His work stories would involve detailed descriptions of pus drainage techniques, the sounds dying people make, and his theories about which body parts decompose fastest. These aren't exactly the intellectual discussions you enjoyed with Caesar and Antony about literature, philosophy, and political strategy. He promises to keep you healthy using medieval medical techniques, but his medical bag contains leeches, a bone saw, and what appears to be a medieval torture device labeled tooth extractor. The leeches are supposed to balance your bodily humors by sucking out excess blood, though the amount they consider excess might leave you feeling dizzy and weak. The bone saw serves multiple purposes, mostly involving the removal of body parts that have become inconvenient through infection or injury. The tooth extractor doubles as a general-purpose tool for grabbing and yanking out anything that seems problematic, whether it's teeth, splinters, or small foreign objects lodged in uncomfortable places. His medical bag resembles a torture chamber toolkit more than healing equipment. Most instruments are designed for cutting, pulling, or draining, rather than actual treatment or cure. The leather bag itself smells like old blood mixed with whatever herbs he uses to mask the scent of his daily work environment. Opening it releases odors that make you question whether medical treatment is worth the sensory assault that accompanies it. The tools look like they haven't been properly maintained, which makes sense given that medieval medicine didn't understand the connection between cleanliness and infection prevention. The mystery evaporates when you realize his healing touch has probably sent more people to their graves than the plague itself managed through natural transmission methods. His treatment success rate appears to be roughly equivalent to doing nothing, except with added suffering and expense. Patients who survive his medical interventions probably do so, despite his help, rather than because of it. The dramatic costume and mysterious presentation can't disguise the fact that his professional expertise might actually make you less likely to survive whatever brought you to seek medical attention in the first place. Lord Reginald of Halitosis Manor appears on your screen, supposedly the catch of the county, wearing what might have once been fine clothing before it became a textile archaeological site. His doublet shows stains that tell stories spanning several seasons, with mysterious dark patches that could be wine, blood, or something you'd rather not identify. The fabric hangs on his frame like it's given up trying to look presentable, sagging in places where moths have held dinner parties. His sleeves are frayed at the edges, suggesting either vigorous use or complete neglect of basic garment maintenance. The whole ensemble looks like it survived a war, lost, and decided to keep fighting anyway. He owns land, has a title, and claims to be educated, which on paper makes him exactly the kind of political alliance you'd normally consider for strategic purposes. His family tree stretches back several generations of minor nobility who managed to hold on to their property through various conflicts and economic disasters. The title carries weight in local politics, opening doors and commanding respect from peasants who have to bow when he rides through their villages. His education includes basic literacy, which puts him ahead of roughly 90% of the medieval population. He can sign his own name without assistance and occasionally reads religious texts during particularly boring winter evenings. But his idea of sophisticated conversation centres on debating whether turnips or cabbage make better soup, and he approaches both sides of this argument with the passion most people reserve for matters of life and death. He has strong opinions about root vegetable preparation techniques, soil conditions that produce optimal turnip yields, and the relative nutritional benefits of different cabbage varieties. His eyes light up when discussing the superiority of his turnip cultivation methods compared to neighbouring lords who clearly don't understand proper farming techniques. This represents the peak of his intellectual engagement, the topic that brings out his most animated discussion skills and deepest analytical thinking. His castle features one room with a window, which he considers the absolute height of luxury and architectural achievement, though the window opening lacks actual glass and is covered with oiled parchment that flaps in the wind. The single window represents a significant investment in his living space, requiring additional construction costs and creating a weak point in the wall that enemies could potentially exploit. He mentions this window frequently in conversation, treating it like a marvel of engineering that demonstrates his wealth and refined taste. The parchment covering keeps out some wind and rain while allowing light to filter through, creating what he describes as a warm, inviting atmosphere that impresses visitors. You once held intellectual salons with the greatest minds of the Mediterranean, hosting scholars who could discuss philosophy, mathematics, astronomy, and literature with equal fluency and genuine insight. Your gatherings included poets who crafted verses that survived centuries, mathematicians who calculated the movements of celestial bodies, and philosophers who pondered questions about the nature of existence itself. These conversations shaped your understanding of the world and influenced political decisions that affected the fate of nations. The level of discourse elevated everyone present, creating an atmosphere where ideas mattered more than social status. Reginald thinks philosophy is something you catch from foreigners, like a disease that spreads through excessive contact with people who ask too many questions about the nature of reality. His educational background didn't include exposure to Greek thinkers or Roman scholars, leaving him suspicious of intellectual pursuits that don't directly relate to land management or livestock care. He views complex thinking as potentially dangerous, the kind of foreign influence that corrupts good Christian values and leads to asking uncomfortable questions about established social order. Philosophy represents the sort of impractical luxury that wastes time better spent on practical concerns like crop rotation and tax collection. Medieval noble marriages functioned as business transactions designed to combine resources, strengthen political alliances, and ensure proper inheritance lines for future generations. Your famously strategic approach to romance always included careful consideration of political benefits, economic advantages, and diplomatic opportunities that relationships could provide. You understood that personal feelings were secondary to the practical results that marriages could achieve in terms of power consolidation and empire building. But even your calculating approach to romantic partnerships maintained certain standards about the quality of potential allies. His dowry offer includes 3 pigs of questionable health, a cow with a slight limp that affects her milk production, and exclusive rights to the turnip field behind his manor that floods every spring. The pigs represent livestock assets that could provide meat and breeding opportunities, assuming they survive whatever respiratory condition makes them wheeze constantly. The cow produces milk sporadically, depending on her mood and the weather conditions that seem to aggravate her leg injury. The turnip field sounds impressive until you learn about its tendency to become a temporary lake whenever seasonal rains arrive, drowning crops and creating muddy disasters that take months to resolve. When someone's greatest achievement involves owning a chair instead of a stool, even political necessity discovers its practical limits in terms of what constitutes acceptable alliance material. His chair represents a significant step up from the bench seating used by lesser nobles, and certainly surpasses the stools that common people use. The chair includes a back support and armrests, demonstrating his elevated status within the feudal hierarchy. He mentions this furniture upgrade frequently, treating it as evidence of his refined lifestyle and superior economic position. The chair symbolizes his success in a world where comfort items are rare and expensive. You've traded kingdoms for love before, making calculated decisions to sacrifice political power for personal happiness and strategic romantic partnerships. But trading down from an empire to a turnip farm feels like a bridge too far, even for someone with your legendary adaptability and political flexibility. A monk slides into your DMs, which seems contradictory to his vows of celibacy, but perfectly fitting for this bizarre medieval dating hellscape, where nothing makes sense and everyone ignores their own rules. Brother Francis appears on your screen wearing simple brown robes that actually look clean, which immediately makes him stand out from the parade of unwashed disasters you've been scrolling through. His profile picture shows him holding a quill pen and looking thoughtfully at a manuscript, suggesting someone who can read and write without moving his lips. The monastery background behind him features actual books, which puts him ahead of 90% of medieval Europe in terms of intellectual resources and basic literacy skills. He claims to be seeking spiritual connection and pure companionship, which sounds refreshingly intellectual after the previous disasters involving turnip farmers and plague doctors with questionable medical practices. His profile mentions deep conversations about faith, philosophy, and the meaning of existence, topics that promise actual mental stimulation instead of discussions about livestock health or optimal cabbage growing techniques. He writes in complete sentences with proper grammar, demonstrating educational achievements that seem miraculous compared to the grunting communication style favored by most medieval men. His interests include illuminated manuscripts, theological debates, and copying sacred texts, which suggests someone capable of engaging with complex ideas. Except his idea of spiritual connection involves confessing your sins, while he takes detailed notes for what he calls theological research purposes, turning intimate conversations into academic exercises with uncomfortable religious overtones. He wants to catalogue your moral failings as case studies for his scholarly work about female spiritual corruption and the various paths to redemption. His questions focus heavily on your romantic history, specifically the details about your relationships with Caesar and Antony, which he frames as research into the nature of temptation and worldly attachment. The confession process requires you to describe every transgression in explicit detail, while he scribbles furiously on parchment, supposedly for the benefit of future theological scholarship. His monastery lifestyle means he's actually cleaner than most options, having discovered the revolutionary concept of washing occasionally as part of religious discipline and community health standards. Medieval monasteries maintained better hygiene than the outside world, with communal bathing schedules and actual soap made from animal fat and plant ash. The monks wash their hands before meals, change their robes regularly, and maintain personal cleanliness as part of their spiritual practice. This puts Brother Francis ahead of knights who haven't removed their armour in months, and lords who consider face dunking a comprehensive bathing routine. The monastery even has latrines that drain properly, which represents advanced sanitation technology by medieval standards. You were worshipped as the reincarnation of Isis, commanded fleets across the Mediterranean, and held the economic fate of the known world in your jeweled hands. But he wants to save your soul from eternal damnation, which feels like a significant downgrade from divine status to charity case. His mission involves converting you from paganism to Christianity, which requires abandoning your identity as a living goddess in favor of becoming a repentant sinner, grateful for religious salvation. The theological implications bother you less than the assumption that your spiritual status needs upgrading rather than recognition. He approaches your legendary accomplishments as obstacles to overcome rather than achievements to celebrate, treating your political and military successes as evidence of prideful corruption that requires humble correction. Medieval church law made relationships with clergy complicated, creating legal and social barriers that discouraged romantic involvement between religious and secular people. But his bigger issue involves never actually having spoken to a woman before joining the monastery as a teenager. His experience with female interaction consists entirely of theoretical knowledge gained from religious texts written by other men who also avoided women. He studied theological treatises about feminine nature without meeting any actual women to test these theories against reality. His understanding of romance comes from scripture and scholarly debates rather than personal experience, leaving him equipped with academic theories, but no practical knowledge about human relationships or basic social interaction between genders. His romantic gestures include copying religious texts by candlelight as gifts and offering to pray for your various sins, which he's happy to enumerate in alphabetical order, with supporting biblical references for each transgression. He creates illuminated manuscripts featuring your name worked into biblical passages about redemption and spiritual transformation. His courtship strategy involves lengthy prayers, asking God to cleanse your soul of worldly corruption, followed by theological discussions about the proper role of women in Christian society. These conversations always circle back to your need for spiritual guidance and his availability as a moral instructor capable of leading you toward religious salvation through patient education and constant prayer. The prayer sessions become increasingly specific about your supposed moral failings, with Brother Francis demonstrating impressive creativity in connecting your past political decisions to various biblical prohibitions against female ambition and independence. He's particularly concerned about your use of makeup, jewelry, and expensive clothing, which he views as vanity that distracts from spiritual development. His romantic advice focuses on embracing humility, accepting male authority, and finding fulfillment through service to others rather than personal achievement. These suggestions feel less like courtship and more like comprehensive personality reconstruction, designed to eliminate everything that made you historically significant. When someone's idea of pillow talk involves reciting Latin prayers and discussing the finer points of theological doctrine, even divine incarnation loses its appeal as a conversation starter. You've been called a goddess before, but being treated like a theological research project hits differently than worshipful reverence from subjects who understood your divine nature. The algorithm has apparently given up on quality matches and served you a peasant whose profile picture is just him standing next to a turnip that appears to be his most prized possession. Gareth poses beside this root vegetable like other men might pose with their war horses or family crests, treating the turnip as a symbol of agricultural success and personal achievement. The turnip itself looks slightly wilted, suggesting either poor growing conditions or the fact that he's been using it as a photographic prop for several weeks. His smile shows genuine pride in this vegetable, which tells you everything about his life priorities and economic situation. The background reveals a muddy field that stretches toward a horizon filled with more mud and occasional patches of struggling crops. He's brutally honest about his situation, listing assets that include half a cow shared with his neighbor, 3 chickens that may or may not still be alive, and a cough that sounds like it's auditioning for the apocalypse with increasing desperation. The cow arrangement involves alternating days for milking rights, which creates scheduling conflicts during times when the animal decides not to cooperate with their shared custody agreement. His chickens live in a wooden box that doubles as his furniture, creating living arrangements that blur the line between human habitation and livestock management. The cough produces sounds that suggest his lungs are hosting their own medieval plague, complete with rattling noises that make conversation challenging and sleep impossible. His life expectancy appears roughly equivalent to a mayfly's brief existence, but he maintains surprising optimism about the upcoming harvest, assuming the plague doesn't claim him before the grain ripens in late summer. Medieval peasant mortality rates meant that reaching 30 qualified as elderly, with most deaths occurring from disease, malnutrition, or work-related injuries that received no medical treatment. His optimism about harvest season represents the kind of hope that keeps people functional when reality offers few reasons for cheerfulness. The plague reference isn't metaphorical. Actual disease outbreaks regularly swept through peasant communities, killing entire families within weeks of the first symptoms appearing. He works 16 hours daily in fields owned by someone else, laboring from dawn until darkness makes continued work impossible, all for the privilege of keeping barely enough grain to avoid starvation during winter months. His workday begins before sunrise with feeding animals and preparing tools, continues through backbreaking field labor under whatever weather conditions nature provides, and ends after sunset with equipment maintenance and planning for tomorrow's identical schedule. The grain allocation system means his landlord takes most of the harvest as rent payment, leaving Gareth with just enough seeds and food to survive until next year's crop comes in. This arrangement keeps peasants perpetually on the edge of survival, unable to accumulate wealth or improve their circumstances through individual effort alone. You commanded fleets that controlled Mediterranean trade routes and managed Egypt's vast agricultural wealth that fed much of the Roman Empire, while he gets genuinely excited about discovering a turnip that's only slightly rotten around the edges. Your economic decisions affected the price of grain across 3 continents, influenced international trade agreements, and determined whether entire regions prospered or suffered through lean years. His excitement over partially spoiled vegetables represents the difference between having dinner and going hungry for another day. The contrast between managing imperial resources and celebrating minor agricultural discoveries highlights the massive gap between your respective life experiences and economic realities. Medieval peasant marriages operated on surprisingly mutual choice principles, mainly because no aristocrats or wealthy families cared enough to arrange unions between people who own nothing worth inheriting. This freedom to choose partners came from social irrelevance rather than progressive thinking about individual rights or romantic love. Peasant couples could marry based on personal preference because their decisions didn't affect political alliances, trade agreements, or inheritance disputes that concern powerful families. The lack of external interference meant genuine affection could develop, but it also reflected their complete exclusion from the economic and political systems that shaped medieval society structure and power distribution. His concept of romantic gestures involves sharing his weekly bread ration, which would actually touch your heart if the bread wasn't composed mostly of sawdust, mixed with whatever grain scraps he could afford after paying rent. The gesture demonstrates genuine sacrifice, since giving away food means accepting personal hunger in a world where calories are scarce and starvation is always possible. His bread probably contains more wood pulp than wheat, with texture that challenges even desperate hunger and nutritional value that barely sustains life. The romantic intention behind food sharing represents authentic generosity, but the practical reality involves consuming substances that would make Egyptian prison food seem luxurious. Medieval bread for peasants often included ingredients that weren't technically food, including groundbark, sawdust, and other organic materials that provided bulk without nutrition. Bakers stretched limited grain supplies with whatever organic matter was available, creating loaves that filled stomachs without providing adequate sustenance. The bread's appearance suggested food, while its contents represented desperation disguised as daily meals. Even the act of eating required considerable determination, when the food itself tasted like construction materials mixed with vague wheat memories. When someone's greatest life aspiration involves owning a complete cow instead of sharing half ownership with a neighbor, even your legendary compassion for common people encounters practical limitations regarding relationship potential. You've lifted entire populations from poverty through effective governance and economic policies that improved living conditions across your territories. But this situation feels less like charitable opportunity and more like adopting a walking medieval disaster that requires constant supervision. As you scroll through more profiles, a disturbing pattern emerges across the medieval dating landscape. Everyone's hobbies include not dying of plague and avoiding rats, which tells you something fundamental about the recreational opportunities available in 14th century Europe. The common interest section reads like a survival manual rather than dating preferences. People list staying indoors, burning aromatic herbs, and checking family members for suspicious lumps as their primary activities. Social gatherings have been replaced by quarantine protocols, and the most popular entertainment involves watching neighbors from safe distances to see who starts coughing first. The medieval dating scene isn't just limited by poor hygiene standards and conversational skills that would embarrass trained parrots. It's literally decimated by disease that spreads faster than gossip in a Roman bathhouse. The Black Death sweeps across Europe like nature's own deletion algorithm, removing potential matches with terrifying efficiency. Your dating pool shrinks daily as the plague claims victims faster than medieval Tinder can update their profiles. The bacteria responsible doesn't discriminate based on social class, personal hygiene, or romantic potential, creating equal opportunity devastation across all demographic categories. Half the profiles display inactive status marked with little skull icons, while the other half feature selfies where people are coughing up blood, like it's the latest fashion trend. The skull markers appear with increasing frequency as you scroll, creating a digital graveyard of former romantic possibilities. Active profiles show people looking progressively sicker, with symptoms ranging from suspicious coughing fits to visible bubonic swellings that destroy any remaining physical attraction. The few remaining photos without obvious disease symptoms were probably taken months ago, before the plague reached their particular village or manor house. Your romantic history included dramatic poisonings and political assassinations, but at least those threats were intentional, stylish, and usually came with advance warning through palace intrigue networks. Egyptian dangers involved calculated risks taken for strategic purposes, with death scenes choreographed for maximum dramatic impact. Roman politics meant watching for daggers hidden in senatorial togas, not worrying about invisible bacteria carried by rodent passengers. The sophisticated nature of Mediterranean threats feels almost civilized compared to medieval Europe's approach to ending lives through random biological warfare distributed by unsuspecting rats. Medieval medicine responds to plague outbreaks with bloodletting techniques, which ironically makes infected people more likely to die faster by weakening their already compromised immune systems. Physicians drain blood from patients who desperately need their remaining strength to fight bacterial infections. The medical logic assumes that removing bad blood will cure disease, but actually accelerates death by reducing the body's natural defenses. Treatments that should help instead guarantee worse outcomes, making medieval medical intervention more dangerous than the original plague symptoms. Seeking professional help becomes a death sentence delivered with good intentions and terrible methodology. Dating during a pandemic means every romantic encounter could literally be your last meeting with anyone, and not in the poetic way you're accustomed to from previous dramatic relationships. Medieval romance transforms into biological Russian roulette, where holding hands might transmit fatal infections. Intimate conversations require maintaining distances that make emotional connection nearly impossible. Physical affection becomes potentially lethal, turning natural romantic instincts into survival hazards. Even brief social interactions carry genuine mortal risk, making courtship a literally life-threatening activity that few people survive long enough to complete successfully. The few surviving bachelors are either fleeing to the countryside, hoping rural isolation will protect them, or barricaded inside their hovels, refusing all social contact until the plague passes. Rural flight creates geographic obstacles that make meeting potential partners logistically impossible without extensive travel through infected territories. Urban bachelors who remain accessible are probably already infected or about to become infected through continued exposure to diseased populations. The survivors worth meeting have made themselves unreachable, while accessible candidates represent active health hazards disguised as romantic opportunities. Social isolation protocols mean that even if you locate a promising bachelor, actually meeting him requires violating safety measures that could kill you both within weeks of your first conversation. Medieval quarantine practices separate potential couples by physical barriers designed to prevent disease transmission. Communication happens through shouted conversations across courtyards or written messages passed by intermediaries who might be carrying infection themselves. Romance conducted at safe distances lacks the personal connection necessary for meaningful relationships, creating emotional barriers that make genuine intimacy practically impossible to achieve or maintain. When the dating pool literally dies off faster than you can swipe through available profiles, even your legendary persistence faces logistical challenges that would frustrate divine patience. The mathematical reality involves fewer potential partners every day, with replacement rates far below mortality statistics. Your famous determination conquered Roman senators and Egyptian priests, but medieval plague creates obstacles that exist beyond human control or influence. No amount of charm, intelligence, or strategic thinking can resurrect dead bachelors or cure active infections that eliminate romantic possibilities faster than you can evaluate them. You survived Roman civil wars that involved calculated political violence, strategic assassinations, and military campaigns with clear objectives and identifiable enemies. Medieval Europe apparently tries killing everyone equally and efficiently through biological warfare that targets the entire population without regard for social status, personal achievement, or historical significance. The plague operates with democratic ruthlessness that makes Roman political violence seem selective and civilized by comparison, creating universal mortality that even legendary queens cannot negotiate with or overcome through traditional diplomatic methods. Curiosity leads you to research local marriage customs, hoping to understand the rules of this bizarre medieval game where everyone seems to be making up the regulations as they stumble through life. You figure that understanding the system might help you navigate this romantic wasteland more effectively, or at least explain why everyone seems confused about basic relationship concepts. The research proves more disturbing than helpful, revealing a legal framework that makes Egyptian tomb curses look straightforward by comparison. Medieval marriage seems refreshingly flexible on the surface. No elaborate ceremonies required, just mutual consent, and maybe a witness or two to confirm that words were actually exchanged. A simple verbal agreement could create a legally binding union, which sounds wonderfully efficient after the complex political negotiations your own marriages required. Couples could declare themselves married in pubs, friends' houses, or even in bed if they were feeling particularly spontaneous about their legal commitments. The church didn't always require priests or religious ceremonies, leaving room for creative wedding locations that would make modern Vegas chapels seem conservative. Except mutual consent often means the bride's father consented, the groom's family consented, and the actual couple's feelings serve purely decorative purposes in the overall arrangement. Parental consent wasn't legally required, but social pressures made individual choice mostly theoretical rather than practical. Families controlled marriage decisions through economic leverage, social expectations, and the threat of complete ostracism for children who defied arranged matches. The legal age for marriage was set at puberty, 12 for girls, 14 for boys, which creates situations that would horrify any civilization with basic human decency standards. Betrothals happened at young ages, with children promised to each other before they understood what marriage actually involved. Beyond sharing meals and living space, the church preached consent, while society ignored individual preferences in favor of family alliances and economic arrangements. Your own strategic marriages involved complex negotiations between powerful adults who who understood the political implications, not children assigned spouses by parents focused on land acquisition and social climbing. Divorce exists in theory, but requires proving impotence, insanity, or discovering that you're related to your spouse, which in medieval Europe happens more often than anyone wants to admit. The only way to end a marriage involves proving it never legally existed in the first place, creating bizarre legal situations where couples must demonstrate their union was invalid from the beginning. Church rules on consanguinity were incredibly strict before 1215, prohibiting marriage between anyone with a great-great-great-great-great-grandparent in common, which eliminated most potential partners in small medieval communities where everyone shares ancestors. Your own family tree included famously complicated sibling marriages, but at least those represented strategic political decisions made by informed adults, rather than accidental discoveries about shared bloodlines. Ptolemaic dynasty politics involved intentional complexity designed to maintain power within the royal family, while medieval relationship disasters happened through ignorance and poor record-keeping. Your marriages created diplomatic advantages and secured political alliances, while medieval couples often discovered their unions were illegal after years of unknowing incest. Medieval wedding nights feature the charming tradition of witnesses ensuring consummation, because privacy apparently qualifies as an exotic luxury concept that most people can't afford. Community participation in verifying marital legitimacy includes the charivari tradition, involving neighbors making noise outside the bedroom to confirm that proper sexual activity occurs according to schedule. These public intrusions transform intimate moments into community entertainment, with marriage becoming a spectator sport that eliminates any possibility of romantic privacy or personal dignity. The church controls marriage law in theory, but most peasants simply declare themselves married and hope nobody important notices or cares enough to investigate their legal status. Rural communities operate on informal recognition systems where couples live together, call themselves married, and assume their relationship has legal standing until someone with authority objects. This creates situations where marriage validity depends on whether local officials decide to enforce church regulations, leaving couples uncertain about their actual legal status until crisis situations arise. The exchange of rings or other gifts seals marriage agreements, with consummation serving as physical confirmation of consent that makes unions legally binding. Engaged couples who sleep together create automatic marriages whether they intended permanent commitment or not, transforming casual intimacy into lifelong legal obligations. This system makes every romantic encounter potentially life-altering, with serious consequences for people who misunderstand the legal implications of physical relationships in medieval society. Marriage serves primarily as property transfer and power consolidation, with the primary goal being economic stability and political alliance, rather than personal happiness or emotional fulfillment. Both partners gain rights and expectations, including the right to demand sexual compliance as part of the marriage contract, while adultery faces severe punishment that often involves public humiliation and physical violence. These arrangements create relationships based on legal obligation, rather than mutual attraction or emotional connection. When local marriage customs make Ptolemaic dynasty politics look straightforward and simple by comparison, you realize you've entered truly foreign territory, where familiar concepts operate according to completely different rules. You've navigated Roman law with its complex legal precedents and Egyptian tradition with its religious requirements, but medieval marriage makes those systems seem like basic diplomatic negotiations conducted by reasonable adults. The combination of church control, family interference, community involvement, and legal uncertainty creates a framework where successful relationships require luck more than skill, and where even legendary queens might struggle to find workable romantic arrangements that don't end in legal disaster or social catastrophe. Frustrated with the parade of unwashed disasters masquerading as eligible bachelors, you decide to update your profile to better reflect your standards and deal breakers. Maybe the problem isn't medieval Europe itself, but rather your failure to communicate exactly what you're looking for in a partner. Perhaps clearer expectations will filter out the plague carriers, turnip farmers, and men whose personal hygiene suggests they've given up on basic human dignity. You approach this task with the same strategic thinking that once shaped Mediterranean politics, treating profile optimization like diplomatic negotiations with potentially life-altering consequences. Your updated preferences start reasonably enough with likes that include power, snakes, multilingual banter, golden barges, and men who've heard of soap. These seem like basic requirements that any civilized person could meet without extraordinary effort or expense. Power represents the kind of ambition and capability that made your previous relationships politically valuable and personally stimulating. Snakes reflect your appreciation for dramatic flair and exotic elements that separate extraordinary experiences from mundane daily routine. Multilingual banter suggests intellectual curiosity and educational achievement that creates engaging conversations instead of grunting exchanges about weather and livestock. Golden barges represent the kind of luxury and sophistication that transforms transportation from survival necessity into artistic expression and political statement. The soap requirement acknowledges that personal cleanliness shouldn't qualify as an impossible achievement, but rather represents basic human maintenance that civilized people perform regularly without considering it heroic accomplishment. These preferences reflect your background as someone accustomed to excellence rather than mere survival. Expecting partners who understand the difference between existing and actually living with style and purpose. Your dislike section proves more challenging to phrase diplomatically, including plagues, sandals with socks, turnip-based economies, and anyone whose idea of bathing involves waiting for rain. These specifications might be too detailed for general medieval audiences, but they address recurring problems you've encountered while scrolling through available bachelors. Plague dislike seems obvious given the mortality rates, but apparently needs stating explicitly, since half the profiles feature people actively dying from infectious diseases. Sandals with socks represents the kind of fashion disaster that suggests complete abandonment of basic aesthetic judgment and cultural awareness. Turnip-based economies eliminate agricultural societies where root vegetables constitute the primary economic foundation and conversational topic. This restriction cuts deep into medieval demographics, but you've endured enough discussions about optimal turnip growing conditions to last several lifetimes. The rain bathing clause addresses hygiene practices that treat personal cleanliness as an accidental byproduct of weather patterns rather than intentional self-maintenance performed on predictable schedules using actual cleaning supplies. You add the requirement that potential partners must speak at least 2 languages fluently. then immediately realize this eliminates roughly 99% of the medieval population. Medieval literacy rates hover near zero for common people, with most nobles struggling through single-language communication that barely qualifies as coherent. Monasteries preserve some multilingual scholarship, but monks took vows that complicate romantic relationships beyond practical feasibility. Your standard eliminates peasants, most knights, and the majority of nobility, leaving a dating pool smaller than most Roman Senate meetings. Your requirement for basic dental hygiene appears to be asking for the impossible in an era where tooth decay counts as natural aging rather than preventable medical condition. Medieval dental care consists mainly of prayer, primitive extraction techniques, and hoping problems resolve themselves through divine intervention or death. The widespread availability of sugar creates dental disasters across all social classes, while treatment options remain limited to procedures that often kill patients faster than the original tooth problems. Even wealthy nobles sport mouths that look like dental graveyards, with more gaps than functional teeth. Medieval medical understanding treats dental pain as inevitable life experience rather than solvable health issue. Your basic hygiene standards assume access to cleaning methods, dietary choices, and medical knowledge that simply don't exist in 14th century Europe. The requirement effectively eliminates everyone who's lived past childhood in medieval conditions, leaving you with a theoretical dating pool of people who don't actually exist in this time period. Medieval Tinder's algorithm keeps suggesting matches based on proximity and still breathing, which sets the bar disturbingly low even by medieval standards. The app's matching system appears designed around basic survival criteria rather than compatibility factors or relationship potential. Geographic closeness matters more than shared interests, intellectual capacity, or personal hygiene standards. The breathing requirement acknowledges plague mortality rates while ignoring quality of life considerations that might make relationships actually worthwhile rather than merely technically possible. You attempt adding seeking intellectual equals for stimulating conversation, but the app keeps autocorrecting intellectual to turnip farmer, apparently reflecting the most sophisticated profession the medieval algorithm recognizes. The software seems programmed to acknowledge only agricultural occupations and basic survival skills as valid personal attributes. Your attempts to specify educational requirements, cultural interests, or philosophical compatibility get translated into farming-related preferences that attract exactly the kind of matches you're trying to avoid. The autocorrect feature reveals systematic problems with medieval technology that extend beyond simple user interface issues. The app's vocabulary appears limited to concepts that medieval programmers could understand, creating translation barriers between your sophisticated preferences and available categorical options. Even basic relationship terminology gets converted into agricultural or survival-related language that fundamentally changes your intended meaning. When your basic requirements for partnership eliminate the entire medieval population, you realize this represents a systemic problem, rather than personal pickiness or unreasonable standards. The issue isn't your expectations, but rather the complete incompatibility between your background and medieval European civilization. Your legendary adaptability conquered Roman politics and Egyptian court intrigue, but apparently has limits that stop somewhere around basic human hygiene and intellectual curiosity. Even divine incarnations have practical boundaries when dealing with civilizations that haven't discovered soap or books. After scrolling through what feels like every unwashed, uneducated, plague-carrying bachelor in medieval Europe, you face a stark realization that hits harder than Egyptian summer heat. The mathematical reality becomes undeniable when you've examined profiles from 3 kingdoms, and somehow the options deteriorate with each geographic expansion. Rural areas offer peasants whose life goals center around owning complete livestock instead of sharing animals with neighbors. Urban centers provide merchants who smell like their goods, and craftsmen whose hygiene standards wouldn't impress Egyptian slaves. Even expanding into neighboring countries reveals the same depressing pattern of men who treat soap like exotic foreign technology. Your legendary romantic career included Julius Caesar and Mark Antony, 2 men who could match your wit, challenge your intellect, and engage in the conversations that shaped the political landscape of the known world. Caesar commanded legions while quoting poetry, switching between languages to make diplomatic points that influenced the fate of nations. Your discussions covered philosophy, military strategy, and economic policy with equal fluency. He appreciated your intelligence as much as your beauty, treating you as an equal partner in both political intrigue and intimate moments. Those conversations happened between equals who understood power, ambition, and the complex dance of Mediterranean politics. Mark Antony brought passion and military genius to your relationship, creating a partnership that lasted 11 years and produced 3 children, while challenging Rome's expanding influence across the ancient world. Your alliance combined Egyptian wealth with Roman military might, creating a power block that threatened the established order and required genuine strategic thinking to maintain. Antony understood your position as pharaoh, respected your political judgment, and engaged with your ideas about governing vast territories populated by diverse cultures. Even your private moments included discussions about literature, art, and the philosophical implications of ruling divine kingdoms in mortal bodies. Medieval Europe offers turnip farmers whose greatest intellectual achievement involves distinguishing between different root vegetables, unwashed knights who confuse chivalry with simply owning horses, and monks who treat women like theological curiosities requiring careful study and spiritual correction. The contrast feels like comparing Egyptian pyramids to mud huts built by drunk children with architectural disabilities. Your previous lovers commanded empires, influenced the course of history, and could engage in conversations that lasted hours without mentioning vegetables, livestock, or their personal relationship with various saints. Here, intellectual discourse means debating whether cabbage grows better than turnips in clay soil. The medieval algorithm suggests expanding your search radius to include additional kingdoms, apparently missing the fundamental issue that distance doesn't improve the basic quality of available bachelors. You've already covered territory equivalent to half the Roman Empire, encountering the same disappointing pattern of men who consider bathing a seasonal activity and complex conversation a foreign concept. Broadening geographic scope reveals more peasants, additional unwashed knights, and monks with slightly different theological specialties, but identical attitudes toward female intellectual capacity. The mathematical relationship between distance and bachelor quality appears inversely proportional, with worse options emerging as you expand beyond immediate geographic boundaries. Scottish Highlands provide warriors whose primary conversation topics include clan warfare and sheep management techniques. French nobility offer men who smell like cheese production facilities and consider philosophy something that happens to other people in foreign countries. Germanic tribes present bachelors whose idea of romance involves kidnapping, followed by lengthy explanations about their superior metalworking capabilities. Even expanding search parameters to include different social classes, age ranges, and professional backgrounds produces the same depressing results of men whose life experiences wouldn't fill a single afternoon in Alexandria's legendary library. Your dramatic exit strategy via ASB suddenly seems not just historically appropriate, but refreshingly civilized compared to medieval alternatives that await legendary queens trapped in backward civilizations. The snake represented exotic sophistication, efficient problem-solving, and dramatic flair that matched your legendary status as divine pharaoh and political mastermind. Death by snakebite carried symbolic weight, connecting to Egyptian religious imagery while avoiding the humiliation of Roman captivity and public parade through enemy territory. The ASP choice demonstrated control over your final moments, refusing to surrender dignity even when facing ultimate defeat. At least the snake possessed exotic beauty, operated with reliable efficiency, and completed its task without spending 20 minutes explaining why turnips produce superior soup compared to cabbage, or describing optimal livestock breeding techniques. Snakes don't require conversation, hygiene maintenance, or intellectual stimulation that medieval bachelors couldn't provide anyway. The ASAP represented a clean solution to an impossible situation, avoiding years of disappointing relationships with men whose greatest achievements involved not dying of plague or owning furniture slightly better than what peasants used for seating. Medieval romance celebrates suffering for love, as though pain creates virtue through mysterious spiritual alchemy. But there's meaningful suffering, and then there's whatever this dating hellscape represents to legendary queens, accustomed to intelligent companionship. Courtly love traditions assume that enduring hardship for romantic purposes builds character and demonstrates genuine devotion to worthy partners. Your situation involves suffering through conversations with men who lack basic education, personal hygiene, and intellectual curiosity about anything beyond immediate survival needs. This isn't noble suffering that creates deeper spiritual connection, but rather torture disguised as social interaction. You delete the app with more force than necessary, watching the medieval interface crumble like poorly constructed castle walls during siege warfare. The wooden tablet screen cracks under pressure, suggesting that even medieval technology recognizes the futility of this romantic endeavor. You call for your ASP with the same calm authority you once used to summon Roman senators and Egyptian priests, treating this final decision like any other political choice that requires decisive action based on available evidence and practical considerations. Sometimes the most romantic choice involves knowing when to make a graceful exit rather than accepting compromises that diminish legendary status through association with inferior civilizations. So if you had to swipe right on a historical figure, who's your risky pick? Drop your answer in the comments. Just know Cleopatra's already ghosted everyone and deleted her profile. Maybe you're into Napoleon, if you like your date to show up with more baggage than height. Or perhaps Shakespeare, but be warned, every compliment comes wrapped in a riddle, and he's never getting to the point. Honestly, maybe just stick to your own century, where soap isn't kept under lock and key, and dinner won't crawl off the table. Sure, modern dating means getting left on read, but at least you don't have to filter out plague doctors and compost perfumed turnip farmers. So, who gets your swipe? Your future ex in shining armor, Some czar who thinks love language means conquest. Bonus points for anyone brave enough to admit they'd swiped right on Attila the Hun. Rest easy, and remember, even legendary queens have deal breakers. Dim the lights, dodge the medieval match requests, and I'll see you in the next What If nightmare.